everyone there. My name is Rain, and today we are really excited to have Jasmine Gui here from Real Asian International Film Festival to speak with us a little bit more about the organization and the work that they do. So Jasmine works as the programmer at Real Asian, and Toronto Real Asian International Film Festival showcases contemporary Asian cinema and works from the Asian diaspora. These films and videos can include artists by East, South, and Southeast Asian artists in Canada, in the US, in Asia, and all over the world. So thank you for coming and joining us. I know, it's a difficult time, so we really want to thank you for sharing your time with us today. So just to start off, can you describe some of the processes that Real Asian goes through in terms of building the community with the Asian artists and filmmakers, the selection process, and also how you develop your relationships or engage with the audience?
So Real Asian is a pretty old festival. It's been around this is our 25th year. That's a really long history, and by extension, then we have a really robust and vibrant community. Artists, filmmakers, and just like the general public, I think we have a long working relationship with them. We have a general callouts, submissions callouts process that is open every year. And that's sort of like a free for all space for anyone that you mentioned earlier in your intro to submit to the festival. So it's like diasporic artists, local artists, international artists, just like Asian creators all over who feel like their work fits into the mandate of our festival are welcome to submit. We also do events throughout the year and work with other festivals, film festivals, arts festivals, Toronto specific, Canada specific festivals. And then we also work with community orgs, art spaces, so that we can build relationships with filmmakers, artists, and like a general public that might not be on our radar or who might not yet know about us. So, the festival is in November, but we definitely spend most of the year developing a lot of relationships and then attending a lot of events and festivals and just sort of being in the community and having those exchanges so that we can hopefully continue to bring like new audiences into relation and also introduce relation to like newer folks, maybe who are just arriving in the country or who are growing up or just are being might be interested in the Asian creative scene for the first time. So quite a variety of things. Yeah.
And so, since the pandemic, how have the needs of the communities that Real Asian serve changed, do you find?
Right. So I think for us, for us, we're a community festival that supports like filmmakers and artists, but also like a general public. So for the creative side, the pandemic has definitely affected a lot of filmmakers and artists who are already navigating like various degrees of precarity, even before the pandemic, right? But now they have to look for new ways to navigate like limited opportunities, to navigate funding, and it's also to try to protect projects that are on hold indefinitely because filming is at a huge like standstill. So one of the largest attractions of Real Asian was always the sense that people could come to our festival, attend it, meet other people, build relationships, and just create opportunities for themselves in a very organic way just by attending and being present. In the online space, because we moved to a digital festival in 2020, this is like very difficult, especially for Asian creators who often feel like they're already navigating industry and workspaces in isolation or without a lot of support. The festival has always been like very proactive about trying to reach and support them through programming and like our initiatives, and like having to rethink all of that through digital structures and through digital programming is definitely like a challenge. And so we are constantly still evolving and like finessing our programs, because the pandemic is also developing, right? And so we're constantly in sort of this like open flux conversation about what those needs are as the pandemic evolves in context and like as it alters and changes like work opportunity, as it alters and changes, like presentation opportunity, and it's like indefinite presentation opportunity. You don't know when the cinemas will ever be open again. You don't know when festivals will resume any sort of in-person format. So what does it mean to like now have work that you need to make through a pandemic, but then also how do you present that, and how do you have an audience, and how do you get feedback? Like just from a career perspective, there's a lot of needs, and then a lot of uncertainty. So as a festival platform, that is sort of an industry node, right? Like a crucial space through which like filmmakers have to go through. Um, how can we support and make clear, and also be in open discussion with the people that we serve in those communities? Like, what do you need? How can we address that and like support? Yeah.
Yeah, so what were some of the changes and challenges that you had to face during this pandemic?
Mm-hmm. We jumped to the digital festival in 2020 in November, and it was very challenging to do that. A lot of our energy and our joy as a festival really comes from like the in-person community gathering at like screenings and gala events. Like it's always very rowdy. It's always very well attended. Just that flow of people coming in and out of festival spaces, whether it's our office or like our screening rooms, our lounge. And then it's like staff, it's like festival family over the years, 25 years of history, volunteers, filmmakers, audience. We like lost all of that. And that's like a big part of the reason why a lot of us work in festival, right? It's like we enjoy that energy a lot. So moving to a digital festival, meant we had to like rethink how we imagined community in like every sense of the word. How do we navigate that kind of accessibility? How do we navigate engagement and enjoyment? Um, how do we navigate like relationships? How do we navigate like an all ages situation? And then varying degrees of access to like technology. So there's just so many factors that come into play when you're trying to put something that's like a pre-established 23 years of like in-person activity. Now you have to translate all of that into a digital experience and accommodate for this huge range of people that traditionally come to your festival looking for certain things. It's like, how do you still give people things that they are familiar with, while also adapting to this new platform, this new space, this new understanding of time, and like awareness, like how do people even know how to move through this festival. So like as a staff, we also had to like learn a lot of things, like through reimagining festival planning, events, implementation, just like production and operations, like very basic logistic things. Like everything changed, right? Like because everything is now digitized. And then on top of that, we also had to navigate like the changing working conditions, right? All of us not being in the office anymore, us going from a festival that uses many, many volunteers to like having next to no volunteers, because there's no need for that in a digital space. But then the way then work and us interact is like really different, because instead of working in big teams with volunteers, it's now us working with spreadsheets, us working with like new kinds of ticketing platforms, different kinds of audio, visual, like which ones are the best, what are the best combos, how do we stream, how do we record, all of those things. Like it's like a completely different way of thinking about teamwork and like just like who does what. And then on top of that, the industry being very severely impacted by the pandemic, film production, as I mentioned, like basically was like at a standstill. So are there even films coming out? Like, is there even content to show, right? And how do we ensure that we still are able to find good content? Because it's not just like any content we show at the festival, right? It has to be content that we connect with, that we find meaningful, that we really want to have a discussion about. And on top of that, also like basic things in the industry that have to be revised, because everything is like not in person. So how do we properly compensate for a film screening to like the filmmaker when there's no head count of an audience anymore, you know? So it's like before it's like, okay, there's a cinema with 300 seats in it. So here's the screening fee attached to that kind of number. Now it's like a digital festival. There's no cap per se. Do we put in a cap? Where who's allowed to watch it, right? Like just Canada wide, just Toronto specific, worldwide, and then the fees all keep changing based on that. So there's just a lot of considerations when you really want to think about care. When you want to make sure that the people that you are supporting and platforming don't feel like you are taking advantage of them in amidst all of sort of this uncertainty, but also trying to ensure that funding is available, that we can afford all the things that we want to do, that we're not over programming and then underpaying, et cetera, et cetera. So just lots of challenges, like from there, they seem, I think there are a lot of invisible challenges.
Mm.
Yeah, a lot of things that are very directly related to sort of the work that we do behind the scenes as festival staff. We really had to put in a lot of extra conversation, lots and lots of meetings. Number of meetings basically like quadrupled, just because everything has to be re-decided on. We don't have any history to go off of anymore. It's like all from scratch. Yeah.
Yeah, I can imagine there's like so many changes that you've had to face that you never had to deal with before.
Yeah, for sure. So,
Mm.
and then on top, yeah, just trying to like make sure that everyone's taken care of. I think that's like the really important challenge,
Mhm.
not making sure you don't miss anybody. Yeah.
Mhm. And has the number of viewership changed, do you find?
Viewers, it's definitely like a fluctuating thing, because on one hand you have like increased access, so people could tune in from anywhere. And I think for us, our films were mostly Canada wide, so you could watch from anywhere in Canada, which is obviously very different from past festivals where you physically have to be in a cinema like to watch our films, right? So that's really great. It increased access. We had a huge jump in terms of where people were watching from
Mhm.
versus like usually where people have to fly in, and that's like obviously way more expensive and not very affordable or sustainable for most people. But on like the exchange for that is that every festival is available online. um, so you have this oversaturation of content, and so people are tired, like
Mhm.
when you have the opportunity to watch hours and hours of films at home, you're actually not going to tap into a lot of them, right? And then on top of that, you now have the opportunity to disengage by clicking pause, whereas before you would have to physically stand up and leave a cinema. So one of the really interesting questions that came up for us is like, how can we ensure people stay till the end of like a film? What And so the question of like what is a good film to program became like a new kind of conversation too, because before we would sometimes be a little experimental or try to consider like, okay, well, people are now in the cinema, so in our short film lineups, for example, we can put a mix of films in, right, where it's like, okay, well, folks are now have to watch everything, so maybe a more well-known film director can be placed with like an emerging film director within the shorts program, so that the people who come to watch the more well-known film, like by default also watch the less known film, and that's how we can create support and like give exposure, right? Now with a digital platform you can just skip if you don't want to watch it. So how
Mhm.
do we try to persuade audiences that like these are filmmakers that deserve your attention, deserve your time and your care? And that's just like, I mean, that conversation's always happening for sure, but because there's so much power now that the audience has to leave, we have to contend with that new kind of power. Yeah. So this doesn't directly address your viewer question, but it's like the viewership fluctuated up and down a lot because like now they had the opportunity to leave for one film and watch the next one. You know what I mean? So the numbers would fluctuate very drastically based on how well the filmmaker was marketing their film, um, whether or not the slot was like competing with like another festival, etc., etc. So those numbers off the top of my head, I know that we were really consistent in terms of delivering really good turnout. The lots and lots of people came to watch the films, but the numbers weren't per se like a huge spike or a huge dip. But the factors for those numbers changed really drastically. Yeah.
Wow, I guess it's more like it's turned from like a live cinema to kind of more like sitting at home flipping through the channel, television kind of thing.
Yeah, really. And so it's like, how do you try to get people to stay on the channel, right? Yeah, it's like
Yeah.
a really interesting way to think about a festival experience, which traditionally festivals don't think about that in that way, because the whole strength of a festival is a in-person attendance, where you sort of like sample things, you know, you're more, maybe you're more bold, you're like try new things because you're in the festival experience. You're like, yeah, I don't usually watch this kind of film, but I'm here, let's try it, right? And now you've like returned it to a platform where viewers can really just be like, nah, I'm not interested, switch, right? And so that's a totally different way of thinking about audience. Yeah.
Mm. Mm. Um, so what are some of the resources that Real Asian has been able to develop or gain or address in terms of what the community needs in response to this pandemic?
Mm-hmm.
'Cause you mentioned about you mentioned about the artists being living precariously, or even what the community needs.
Mm. So, I mean, so to address the artist side of things first, we were quite early on in talks with a lot of other festivals to rethink like basic screening fees, and then setting up guidelines so that across the board, as many festivals as possible are paying equitably. This is always going to be like a very difficult conversation for this industry. There's always going to be a lot of like exploitation, and so as much as possible, how to address it directly, how to really think through like the structural problems of the industry. And that's like a very specific kind of conversation, but we definitely were in those conversations really early, and then we made very specific kinds of decisions to protect like not just the fees of our artists, but also this fear around piracy. Because now, if you're watching it on your device at home, you could record it, right? And then a lot of like filmmakers are afraid that their work will then be compromised, especially if it's new work that still needs to travel through a festival circuit looking for audiences, or is trying to get more funding and trying to get visibility in a sustainable way for the filmmaker who has put so much money into the work, right? So how do they try to even break even? And it's very difficult. So like a lot of those kinds of conversations, and then we're part of a lot of industry continuing conversation. This conversation is continuing this year, obviously, because the platforms are here to stay. Digital presentation is here to stay, and so we have to permanently include these conversations in when it comes to money. Um, in regards to like audiences in general, we switched to like a live box office support system where you could ask for support most of the day during the festival online, just like a chat function. So these are like new roles at the festival that we didn't have before.
Mhm.
um, so for folks to just help with problems navigating like digital sign in, how to see the film, like where do I go, how do I get a ticket, whereas before it's like a physical table with a sign. It's like easy to for people to just go up and be like, oh well, I can't get a ticket, or I don't know where the cinema is. Now it's like my link won't load, I have audio problems, payments not going through, which is like a totally different kind of definitely a different kind of like support needed, different kind of tech support that you like need to provide, right? What was really nice is we also were able this year to provide like ASL support for all the live events during the festival, um, to better support like folks and audiences from the deaf and hard of hearing communities. That was like a new first for us, that we were able to do this and think through it very intentionally, because we are digitizing all of the talks. So that was like a really, really good, I think, development for our festival. And it's something we're going to try to continue to maintain and improve on with like every iteration of the festival going forward. Um, And then lastly, I think we started a digital film forum space on Discord. So this allows us like year-round access to some sort of casual community conversation and interaction. So we saw like 200, 300 people hop into the server over the course of the festival, talk about the films, talk about resources and opportunities. And then it also becomes like a place for Real Asian to like send announcements, promote events, and sort of like funding uh, opportunities, career development opportunities. So you can join these channels based on your sort of status within the festival. Are you a filmmaker? Are you an audience? Like, what do you want to pay attention to? And then within these channels, we provide updates and links and interaction. And so it's something we're going to continue to develop also this year because we want it to be like a year-round space. Um, it was activated for the festival, and so now it's like a lot quieter, but we're looking for ways to keep a sort of baseline interaction moving on, like following, and then look for new ways to imagine gatherings and communities in this sort of like COVID, post-COVID future. Because yeah, it will stay. Like we're definitely going to continue with digitized spaces, even when we go back to physical festival. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so, as we are in facing in this second lockdown, and
Mm.
of course now the festival is over, um, what is it like now at Real Asian with the lockdown, and you're not, actively working on a festival right now? Like, are there other changes or challenges that you're working on?
Mm-hmm.
Program activities that you are organizing now, or new activities that you're going to need to organize now?
Mm-hmm. So usually in May we have our school tours, and they are tied to Asian Heritage Month. The school tours really give us an opportunity to take Asian filmmakers into schools to engage with like high school youth, introduce local creators to students. This program was canceled in 2020 because that was the first lockdown period, and so we just like lost this really valuable opportunity that we have been running for quite a few years. Um, and it's on an indefinite hold, right? Because schools also are trying to figure out what's going on and how they can like structure for the future. And so outreach programs like these are like super important to Real Asians mandate, because we really want to educate youth. We really want to use these opportunities to increase the visibility of Asian filmmakers in curriculum learning specifically, so in school settings as well. Um, During the November 2020 festival, we reached out to a number of schools and tried some digital screenings, so gave them access to the digital platform so that they could bring their students to watch these short programs. So we were able to restore a little bit of that um, possibility with the November festival, but obviously the engagement's not really the same because the schools just watch the films on their own. There's no real interaction between the schools and the festival. So it's very disjointed. It's not at all in the spirit of what we want to do with these education programs. So it's ongoing in terms of how now, like now is really the time where we start to take a lot of these ideas to drawing board again, because we are in the early stage of festival planning. It almost never ends, the festival planning cycle. We get like 2 months off and then we sort of start all over again. So we're in that stage now where everything is at drawing board, looking at funding, looking at timelines, looking at possibilities, and then we'll start to test iterations of things. We'll start to experiment, start to build out, and then start to reach out to people to put the necessary structure together. So it's like an ongoing refinement process, if you can think about it that way. But I think one of the really great things that we had as a challenge that we really translated into a new sort of future program that's like really good quality, that's like has a lot of potential for engagement, and I think really addresses community needs is our We Asian programming. So the We Asian program is specifically geared towards like kids, children.
Mm.
And in the past, the We Asian program was like one single afternoon of programming on a weekend. And so caregivers could drop off children to this room where films would be programmed and screening, and then art activities would be happening, and like really fun engagement activities with like local artists. And we partner with like bookstores in the past to do like book readings and stuff.
Mm.
So that was really fun and it was really great. But with this November festival, what we managed to do was we created a arts channel for it. So we had this like shorts program of children's films that were playing and could be accessed for free at any point in the festival, all throughout the festival. We also had arts channel where we would commission artists to do demonstrations of art activities through video. And so essentially caregivers, especially those who are working, could just like play it with the materials available, and then kids could be sufficiently entertained or occupied for a number of hours, right? And this is super important because so many working families and caregivers are like struggling through this pandemic with being just burdened with their kids being home all the time. And I think like the structure of the We Asian Arts Channel just really rose to the challenge of rethinking how our move to digital could best benefit the community. So it's not just like a compromise while we wait for the pandemic to be over. You know, it's really thinking about how can we stay meaningful, how can we stay relevant, and are also being proactive about meeting the needs of our audience and our community. So we know that these problems exist. How can we modify our programs using the tools that we have to maybe, you know, keep them company in this time, right? So yeah, I think that was like a really great success for us in this past year of programming. So we hope we can continue developing through the second lockdown and the longer term sort of after effects of the pandemic. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that's really interesting that you actually have quite a few programming, and it seems like the programming for youth and kids are growing, I guess, from the sound of it, and or like developing into something that would be very interesting for the future.
Yeah, we hope so. Hope that it will, you know, because like the digital platform allows us to reach like nationally. So it's cool to be able to offer things to families and caregivers like all over the country. That's like really exciting for us to be able to do. But of course, like also having to navigate like different access to technology. So, you know,
Mm-hmm.
that is something that we talk about too. And like continuing to brainstorm around how can we best accommodate for as many people as possible who exist in our community. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In terms of working with other community partners, including Protect or any other film festivals, I think you mentioned already, how do you see your work and organization feeling supported, or how can other organizations and group effectively address the needs of your organization, your communities?
hmm So I think, I mean, sharing information is like a very basic uh, support. So this conversation that we're having is great, and also just in general, being able to exchange opportunities, resources, what we're doing, and getting that information out there so people even just know this is happening is really useful. And then, I mean, this is a great segue question from what we were just talking about, right? Because I mentioned that we obviously want to address questions of access. There's so many factors when it comes to implementation and bringing these programs into communities. So this is where community partnerships are really necessary. We are a film festival. We have expertise in a certain area. We don't have all the expertise required to meet all the evolving challenges that we're facing. But community orgs are built in their own ways, unique ways to address very specific challenges, right? And so those partnerships are what will allow us to translate our programming into specific community situations or conditions. For example, community centers that are clusters of for like communities, meeting spaces. How are they continuing community engagement in this time? Is there a way that we can partner together to bring our programming so that, you know, what we have to offer can match up in some way to the ways in which they continue to activate community spaces, and that will, they know very specifically what the community needs and limitations are, and what resources are available. So how can we pay attention to that, listen to that, and then figure out how we can best bring what we have to those spaces. I think those are like really, really great support relations, like sort of a web that relation has historically been very good at activating, and we hope that we can continue to keep activating that in different ways. I
Mm-hmm.
think another more general way of supporting is also to just recognize artists' work as labor. They're like really compromised groups of folks, like in this time, with work being so precarious, and then the value of the work being produced not being properly understood and addressed. And obviously, this is a problem that exists in the Asian community, right, where art is very undervalued, despite the fact that art is what will get a lot of us through, like in this time, um, whether it be just like entertainment or enjoyment, or just like a means to communicate, or to even just like take care of ourselves, right? So advocating for proper compensation for artists in like across all circumstances, whether it be like local workshop activities, or asking, partnering with them to do interesting campaigns, to do workshops or whatever, giving them work opportunity. um, I think this helps with the ecosystem at large, just like anyone who has power to distribute funding and opportunity to like remember artists' work and remember artists and take care of them. It gives proper value to the work of like Asian community members, who are artists and filmmakers. And, these are the people who tell our stories and histories and give us like creative experiences that are really meaningful. So that's like a really, I think, very general baseline support that's super crucial, that is going to help and support our community at large. Like everyone benefits, right, when you support our storytellers. So yeah.
Yeah. Actually, yeah, yeah. I mean, you raise a really good point in terms of like the value, right? Like, I think um, the sense of valuing artists and the artistic practices is something that is something that is an ongoing issue that I feel that all of us can address, and of course the Asian community as well too. And I was also thinking about how our artists are actually folks that also really understand using the imagination, and I think more recently I was thinking about how like it's so important for us to really be able to develop the use of imagination as a really practical skill in terms of how we want to create our future, because
Yeah.
um, like otherwise we would be doing the same thing over and over,
Yeah.
which is fine, but then the world is always changing, and in order to adapt to those changes we actually do need this creativity and this skill of imagination in order to imagine something better for us.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Super
Yeah.
important.
I do actually have a few more questions, just because now I'm so inspired by all this.
Oh, dang. Okay, go.
I mean, I have a history with art as well too, so
Yes, of course.
in terms of funding, have you noticed that the funding opportunities have changed or altered, or have you had to change your ways of applying for funding?
Um, yes and no. There's a lot of COVID response funding that is appearing, but like funding when it comes from government and private sector, they tend to have a lot of strings attached to them. So what you really want is to create a space where people are free to do the work that they feel is important, right? And not necessarily the work that other people feel is important. And that's such a necessary space of freedom for artists. Um, and so it's a really tricky negotiation when like so much of your funding is tied to all these needs, guidelines, like checkboxes. But that's also how the Canadian arts ecosystem is built. So it's this very difficult negotiation. Um, so in regards to whether or not funding is changing drastically, I don't know how permanent it is, um, but the COVID funding that is coming through, and then whether or not that's sustainable. So it's like it can start a project, but can it see a project through to the end? Those are two different conversations, right? Let's say they're giving you money now to start like a production company, but then once your production company started, the kinds of projects you want to make, they're not interested in funding. Like that is still a barrier. So the questions around funding are really related to politics. They're related to understanding of identity, understanding of like belonging, understanding of like what stories are normal, quote unquote, what stories are necessary. And that's why, you know, art organizations, many of them exist to challenge and reimagine and rethink what is good and what is necessary. Just because what we have historically as a precedent is very exclusionary. Lots and lots of stories don't fit the criteria of what is necessary, right? And so, community organizations and art organizations like Relation and many, many others, trying to ask those difficult questions and then create those gaps, those necessary gaps in spaces and opportunities and tools and resources, whether they be like workshops or networking or, you know, platform um, intel information, right? Support, whether it's like writing for funding, navigating the legal side of things, um, pitching to TV, um, you know, looking for sponsorship. Like all these things are all like necessary and difficult parts of the funding conversation. So they're all sort of like a big ball. um, so I don't know if I answered that in a clear, direct way, but I think like you have to think about all of those things evolving and changing. And this is a really great moment to challenge a lot of the pre-existing assumptions. Um, there's a lot of accountability being asked for
Mm.
with big funding organizations sitting on so much money, being like, where's this money going? How can you account for the bad pattern of the same few privileged folks getting the same amount of money over and over again?
Mhm.
And like, what does it mean to reimagine and expand the idea of like who gets to tell stories? So I think that's like a ongoing conversation. COVID started way before COVID, obviously, has been always around, but COVID definitely presents some interesting, like unique opportunities to have certain kinds of conversations. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, you're absolutely right. I remember because I know that within the arts, different disciplines of art industry, all across the board, it always has been like this. One of the struggles is like there's money to start projects, but then there's always like doesn't seem to be like money to sustain artists
Yeah.
in a sustainable way, which is why artists are often so precarious.
Yeah.
And I know that there's always been a lot of issues and problems within the various arts industry. And so it seems like now the pandemic has amplified the need to have these conversations. And so there seems to be a larger, um, you know, there's more conversations happening around some of these issues, especially with like more marginalized voices. So
Yeah, for sure.
yeah.
For sure.
Do you have any other ideas or thoughts or call for action that you would like to share with our audience?
Yeah, I mean, this is so it's really interesting that we're talking about this right now. But one of the big topics that Real Asian tackled very head on in our 2020 festival is like anti-Black racism in the Asian community. We opened with a documentary called Down a Dark Stairwell, which documents the shooting of Akai Gurley by Peter Liang in New York in 2014. So the cop in question is Asian American. And so this just was like a sort of like explosive historical moment where a lot of racial violence, a lot of racial assumptions, and like deep seated prejudices and problems in the Asian community like came to the surface, right? And I think like the Asian community at large has a lot of work to do to build better understanding of like how our communities perpetuate and enable violence against Black communities. and then how we should be more proactive in learning about racism, learning about structural like violence, and that how we can better support and partner with, people in Black community and like allies in the Asian community who are always doing this work that's so necessary to, as you said before, imagine like a better future. It's like we really need the imagination to move away from the past and the present of how we understand ourselves in relation to other people, how we understand our communities in relation to other communities, and like, can we build better language, can we build better understanding, so that we can really address some of the deep problems that like continue to keep us apart and continue to allow us to, you know sit comfortably in certain kinds of privileges, and then also like be on the receiving end of something like of racism. It's like we don't eliminate racism by not being its targets. It's just like it continues to exist, and it doesn't help anyone if it continues to exist. So like, how do we properly address that question? And I think it's a really difficult call to action to be like, examine your own prejudice as a community. We're so not down to do that. So like, what are those prejudices, what are those assumptions, and then how can we like take very concrete steps to challenging them, opening up space for conversation. I think like every little bit of that effort is really necessary. Every little bit of effort, builds towards like a critical mass of change, whether that be like a private conversation, reading something new, watching something different, being in relationship with different people, paying attention to a different news source. So many like little things, right, that like can become like tangible steps towards this larger thing. And I think like Real Asian as a film festival has a responsibility to openly be part of that discussion, openly be platforming work that we think addresses these things. We have really difficult conversations as festival staff about these things because we also inhabit different positions and like are constantly having to unlearn things, check our own assumptions, and like see where our limitations are, right? And so that process is something we engage in as like staff, and we hope that like that care work and that intentionality like spills over into how the festival is built, but then also how the festival is experienced. And I think it'd be really nice if that like also showed up in the way we did our partnerships and the way we did our our outreach, and then our audiences like feeling like they have the ability to also take those steps because of their experiences with our festival. I think that's just like a dream. It's a really a good one. But I think also one that we try really hard to like work towards like every year with like all the activities that we're doing. So it's nice that like that conversation we just had about what is necessary and what is good. I think that conversation is like much bigger than just the Asian community, but we need to like play a much bigger role in holding ourselves accountable to that conversation. Like, who do we think is necessary and who do we think is good? Like, that's also a question we need to have, right? And I hope that like art, necessary and good art, like pushes us in the direction of having those conversations. Yeah.
And I do appreciate that there are certain Asian artists that are really active in pursuing these issues around within our own community and anti-Black racism. Of course, we could definitely do more, um, but yeah, I do appreciate that Real Asian is on that.
Yeah, I think it's necessary. I think it's like we don't have if we sit on funding and we have a platform and we have so much power as a festival to give opportunity and to give spotlight to people, like we should be very intentional about how we're using that kind of power. Yeah.
Mm. So finally, now that we've spoken so much about Real Asian, do you tell us how people in the public can get involved, whether with your organization or volunteers or see your shows?
So, realasian.com, like revamped website. It's very nice and pretty and easy to navigate. Um, yeah, you can find us there. There's a contact us page there, so you can reach us by like email. I wouldn't recommend phone calls now because the office is not open, but email definitely. And then we're also on all like social media platforms as Relation. You can look for us on YouTube actually to see highlights and recordings of last year's festival events. So, like all the panel discussions, the artist talks, the filmmaker interviews, those are all available online for free. So those are still accessible and can be seen. And then you can also subscribe to our newsletter, I believe, and like that comes out and bi-weekly, once a month, like depending on the time of the year. And that's where you can hear about like opportunities, and just like any sort of like events, upcoming events, or like collaboration possibilities. So yeah, I think I covered everything.
And you can send me the links as well.
Yeah, I'll do that. That's a good idea.
Yeah. Wow. So thank you so much, Jasmine, for joining us today and
Mhm.
having this conversation with us.
No problem. Thanks for having me. This was fun.